so that you will be having an opportunity to get these recordings later, so that if you need to go back and recheck something, you can certainly do that. Okay. And you should have all gotten the electronic handouts I sent to you last night. Wanted you to have those in the event that you wanted to make some edits or things of that nature in the notation. But I am going to show you a couple of different websites, go through the content with you, and hopefully answer any questions that you have. So we do have one intern that is connecting virtually. So I've told her she can ask questions via the chat. I will monitor that. And if you have some questions, feel free to raise your hand if you need to move a little closer for me to hear you. But I do want to make sure that we engage with questions that you have as we go through. All right. So first and foremost, just a reminder, at the beginning of fall semester, you had accounts created for you all in Handshake if you were not a UW Green Bay alumnus, and realize that that access is still there. And I'm going to share and make sure that you understand about utilizing Handshake as we go on, as it is certainly a job platform that you might want to utilize for employment purposes. Okay. So the first thing that I do want to talk about, and I'm going to share my screen now with you, has to do with the first page of the handout. And that has to do with the NACE career readiness competencies. And I talk with every group of students about this because this is a survey of organizations that hire college level professionals, and it goes across all industries. And I think this year in particular, it's important that I point out a couple of differences. This has been something that I've been tracking for many, many years. The NACE competencies were revised and updated. So prior to this year, equity and inclusion, for example, was identified as sort of global competency. But it's important to point out that specifically equity and inclusion moved up on its ratings of importance. And I don't think that that's a surprise to anybody, given everything that has happened in our country in the last 18 months in terms of having to do with equity and inclusion. So I share this because increasingly candidates are being asked to respond to an application question about equity and inclusion. They are asked to address that as well as during an interview. So previously, that item would have been potentially the lowest on the list of 8 or the second lowest. And now you see that it has moved up and it is number 4. I also think critically important is this is the first time that leadership is at the very bottom. And I think there's a reason for that. Again, I think this reflects the nature of work and how things are changing. Teamwork, communication, being able to critically analyze and problem solve is becoming increasingly important. All right. So I want you to be aware of those. If you need a more in-depth, detailed information, I can share that with you. And there is a one-page handout that we have for our undergraduate students that I will share with you that I think you might find helpful. I'll follow up and send that via email. The other thing that I want to mention too is what influences candidate attributes. And this is particularly important because you're building your resume, you're looking at application questions, and you're moving through this process. So critically for you, the internship experience is critical, right? So making sure and thinking about how you're going to present that on your application materials. And there really are a couple of different ways that you can approach that depending upon your own preference. I don't think there's any right or wrong way to present that information. But I also do want to point out the issue about no work experience is that I think sometimes candidates give an impression of not having some good basic general work experience because they omit things that they don't see that are directly related. So you had positions that were helping you through college. If you're a returning adult student, you might have worked before you came back to this internship program. Those can't be the forefront and most critical presentation of your resume, but you don't want to eliminate them either, because that is influential in how they see you as a candidate. And then lastly, I want to take a look at what percent respondents say they're looking for certain items on resumes. Again, doing this because you're going to be preparing your resume, you're going to be looking for positions, and what are some things to keep in mind as you generate your own resume. So that's percent of respondents in terms of what do they seek and actually look for on that candidate resume. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen because it's a little easier for me to then see you as a group if you've got any questions. So if there aren't any questions, then we're going to move into talking about resume development, okay? And nothing in the chat, and I don't see a hand raised. So we're going to move to that then. This is a PowerPoint presentation that I use when I talk about resumes on campus in general. If you find that it would be helpful for you to have these slides, I will be sharing those with you as well. Not a problem to do that. But also too, I will then move to the sample resumes that I provided to you as a talking point after I go through some of the basics on resume writing, okay? So I'm going to go back and share my screen again and go through with resume basics, okay? And if by chance at any point that I'm sharing a screen and you can't see it, please let me know, okay? That would be important. All right. So the first thing that I want to think about is when you're looking at resumes is just some standard overview pieces, okay? It's the standard way that you're going to apply. Yes, an application might be required because that often is sort of a piece that is consistent for everybody. It's the best way that you're going to present your candidacy in a professional manner. There are some basic guidelines in terms of formatting and presentation to make it easy for someone to read through it. Now, there are employers and individuals who have personal preferences. So if I took one resume and I shared it amongst all of you, kind of like the sample that I did in the packet, and asked you for your perspective, you're going to get different opinions. Like, I like this and I don't like that. This seems good to me and this doesn't. That is by far going to happen to you, okay? What's most important is you need to like how you look on paper, all right? So I encourage you to get some feedback from some of your preceptors, some of your classmates, fellow interns, other people you know who might be looking at resumes for a living, getting some feedback, some from professional mentors, other people working in the field of nutrition. But ultimately, I want you to like what you look like on paper. And I'm going to encourage you to think about having different resumes depending upon the type of nutrition position that you are seeking. So if you're thinking about something that's in a school district setting, a little different from something that might be in a clinical or hospital setting, ideally having a different resume is best. I know that that's a lot of work for candidates, and most often they're going to just think of one, okay? And that's your choice, okay? Now, basic kind of headings and categories are some of the things that you see here. When you have an objective on a resume, the objective typically identifies the type of opportunity that you're seeking. It usually is not specific to, say, a clinical dietitian with Bellin Hospital, but identifying a clinical dietitian role, and particularly within a possible industry or setting, and emphasizing some skills that you have can be valuable. But an objective typically is not really detailed, all right? The rest of the information that you have is also appropriate to consider. So education, I want you to have that at the forefront, at the top of your resume. Why? Because you're completing the level of education that's required for you to gain entry into your field, okay? Years from now, like me, my education section is on the bottom of page 2. Why? I haven't gone on to get a PhD. It isn't, it's required for me to have that master's degree in the work that I have. But what's most important now is the work experience that I've had, because I'm meeting that minimal requirement for entry. So I'm going to try to give you some information that's important now, and then how you might transition this resume later on, okay? The other thing is 3 or 4 years, the only thing that's really going to matter about your undergraduate education and about your time at UW Green Bay in the nutrition program is that exactly. So involvement, student organizations, those types of things, that's going to likely go away. It's not critical important. What's going to be important is your work as a dietitian, your work in the field of nutrition, any things that you do post that might be involved with volunteer, community service. Those are the types of things that are going to be more critically important, okay? I take one exception. If you are an individual who has participated in any type of research study, you've done a related presentation to that research, or you've done something that means that that work is published, that has value for keeping it on for a little bit longer, because that's often something that's unique about candidates, okay? Now, just because all of these headings are shared doesn't mean that you have to have all of them, because what I wouldn't want you to do is to have 15 different headings with one item each in it. So what do I mean by that, Linda? So as an example, as an award and honor, if my only award, which I don't want to minimize that by putting it in one category by itself, is the fact that I earned Dean's List throughout my 4 years as my undergrad. I can put that information in the education entry about my undergraduate education rather than having it in a standalone category. But if I have other potential honors and awards, then it might make sense to make that stand out. So this is where you have some choices to make your resume a little different and unique and get some feedback and some suggestions from other people. Same thing could be true for training and professional development. So say through your rotation in a hospital, you get something specific related to your work in that hospital that had to do with training. And that might be the only thing outside of the structured dietetic internship that you're in. Maybe I don't want to think about having a training and professional development category, but in 3 years, when I go for continuing education credits and I keep my licensure and I've gone to other sort of professional opportunities, having that section certainly potentially makes sense. All right. So I can see the group as a whole right now. And I also see that Grant just came back in. So let me know if I need to pause because he needs to do something. But does anybody have a question just about these basic categories? I think they're pretty straightforward, and I can answer them in more detail when we get to the sample dietitian resume. Okay.
Linda, we are obscuring your screen right now.
That's fine. Can I continue, Grant, or you want me to wait?
Go ahead, keep going.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, some basic components and themes to think through your resume development. Consistency, clarity, and conciseness is pretty important. So consistency, how you list information, where it physically is located, because it makes it easy for someone to read. How concise can you be? So resumes are phrases, no sentences or paragraphs. They are action-oriented phrases. Delegated responsibility to X. Created an educational programming about obesity in adolescent individuals, as an example. I'm not using I, me's, or my's, and I'm not creating long narrative statements. They just are not easy for people to read, all right? Also think about clarity. So do I need to say that these are high school students? These are dietetic patients? Are these elderly or geriatric patients? How do I want to use and provide clarity to what I'm doing? Because just developing an educational program is pretty basic. Do I need to say that it is about nutrition? What level of nutrition? Is it about obesity? Who is it designed for, etc.? Okay, as well as thinking about quantity. So how large the group is, how many people, large the budget, how many times did I do this presentation? Did I do it once, twice, 15 times? Those types of things add value to what you're including on your resume, all right? And again, that qualifying, adding into clarity in terms of who's the audience, who's the population, what's the nature of the content, okay? Want you to use action verbs. Overly used action verbs are assist and organize and coordinate. And trust me, you can think of more accurate words. So just thinking about using edit, author, publish, write, develop, there may be different reasons why I would use those specific words because they indicate something very unique. So consider that. It's a present tense verb if it's still happening. It's typically a past tense verb if it's something that has already happened or I've ended that experience. You need to have a good balance between white space and text. Why? Readability, easy of finding information. Now, highlighting is important. Remember that highlighting is the word highlighting, bring attention. So you do not want to overly use highlighting. Highlighting is bolding, capitalizing, underlining, italics, use potentially of a different size font. I would not recommend changing font styles. That oftentimes appears cluttered and messy and not professional. So pick a font style and use it pretty consistently. Think about your margins. You don't just have to have the standard 1-inch margins all the way around. You can cheat a little bit. Indentation helps to break and categorize. Is there a standard amount of indentation on a resume? Is it 2 spaces? Is it 3? No, there isn't. But what I do want you to think about is, I always encourage people to do a half-page test or even a third-page test. If you are indenting an entire third of your page, think about how much of that document is now not being utilized. And in most cases, your resume is going to be no more than 2 pages. Now, some people will really say 1 page for a new professional. I'm flexible, and Career Services is too. What we don't want is for you to not showcase your candidacy in the best way possible. But 2 pages, that's your max. I have a 2-page resume. I have 30+ years of experience. I also have a 1-page resume as well in the event that I feel that that has been necessary and needed, okay? Your goal is to make it easy for the reviewer to find your information, generate interest in your candidacy, and want to keep you in the process and move on to get to know you better. Overall font size. If you open up Microsoft Word, it's going to default to 12 point. That's a pretty large type. Don't go smaller than 10 point, because then you're getting to textbook size point. And you can go in half-point increments. So 10.5, 11, 11.5. Do my headings need to be a larger font than the text? No, but they can be. They appear bigger if they're capitalized and potentially if they're bolded. And then also think of font style, something that's pretty clear, easily read, scannable. And if you've used any different font styles, you know that some font styles allow more space on a line, which can help when you're trying to manage a page. And then obviously no grammatical or typographical errors. What I want you to do is not rely on spell check. I want you to take your resume and I want you to read it out loud. Let your eye and your ear connect. Have other people read it. I can tell you that I have students who get very frustrated when I review a resume and I'll find a typo immediately. Well, you've been looking at it for how long and you're used to seeing certain things. So just make sure that you're free of those typographical errors, okay? And then my other piece about basic components and themes that I'll just go through as well is, I already talked about that 1-page information. Nothing from high school should be there for you at all, because you've completed an undergraduate degree, you've gone on to this dietetic internship, all right? You can do bullets or a paragraph format. I'll show you the difference of what that means. And in most cases, remember, the first screen is going to be a limited amount of time. And in some cases, the first screen may not be by a human. And I'll talk about applicant tracking systems and some things that you can do to potentially get past if that is going to happen, meaning an electronic or computer screen, okay? I don't want you to have any information missing. So if you omit an employer, or you don't tell me where it is with the city and state, or you don't include dates, that could be something that could be seen as a red flag and could be problematic for an employer. And I already mentioned about, ideally, a new resume for every type of opportunity, and always revisit the resume before you make a new application. Okay, that's going to be critically important as well. Final couple of things I want to say. I doubt very seriously you're going to be sending this document ever in by mail. You might, but that would be rare. It's likely going to be electronic, or it's going to be done by email. So attaching it to email as a PDF is pretty important. Don't just call it resume and attach it. I get those from students all the time. I have to right click and save it because I don't want Maggie getting Heather's resume and vice versa. So just name your resume, Linda Peacock Landrum, January 2022, so I know what version it is, okay? And when you save it as a PDF, make sure that it actually transfers okay in that save to a PDF. It didn't freak out the margins in any way. It did not translate some bullet or graphic in some odd way. That's important. If you can attach a PDF to an online application system, I think that's better because it doesn't impact formatting, but you may not be able to do that as a PDF. Think about a rich text format because the formatting may not matter as well. If you are doing it in person or mail, we want you to use some good quality paper that's conservative color. And then I will be talking about a references sheet later on because I don't want you to take up valuable space on a resume, including your references. Treat the references as a separate sheet of paper as an addendum. So I could have a 2-page resume and I could have a references sheet, and that references sheet is only going to be provided when people ask for it, okay? The last thing that I'm going to mention, and then I'm going to stop for questions and pull up a sample dietitian resume, is Career Services will review these for you. We have found, we convinced students through COVID, virtual for these are better. Why? You can share the screen. We can actually show and illustrate some of the formatting changes that we're wanting to make. You don't have to make crazy notes. You can make some of those online changes maybe directly on your document separately when we're talking about that. So that's why we have found that these are important. So you can make an appointment and have somebody in Career Services review that for you, okay? All right, so I'm going to stop sharing that and I'm going to come back now and then I'm going to pull up that sample resume so that we can then take some questions that you might have, okay? So let me see what kind of questions that you might have that I can answer for you related to what I covered in basics about interviewing. Sorry, resume writing. Ahead of myself. Sorry about that.
Has anyone started their resume yet? Like updated it? Okay, Lindsay has, Maria has. Okay, that's a good start.
How do you feel about including like a list of soft skills or like, is that appropriate even if you don't have an explanation underneath, but you know, creativity and leadership and public speaking, etc.?
Well, if you remember on my categories, I did have qualification, summary, or skills. Those would be where you would put those types of items. So first thing to think of mind is if I'm putting that on my resume, I've got to have an example to illustrate that, right? So if I'm going to say that I have effective leadership skills, I've got to think of some great examples where I've utilized my leadership skills. Otherwise, I'm going to put myself in a liability. All right.
Right.
So those can be appropriate statements that can go on. I'll be honest with you again, if you ask different people, some are going to say, no, it's a waste of time, don't do it. And others like to see it. It does pick up if it goes through an applicant tracking scanner, because maybe in the qualifications, they're looking for leadership, communication, and you struggling with other ways to find out how to put those words on your resume. So it will trigger and pick those up. That is a very good section that can very easily change. So if I'm going to be a clinical dietitian and I'm applying at Bellin and HSHS and also at Aurora, that section could very easily change in terms of a candidate summary or skills or qualifications and tailor for those specific opportunities, why I might see from the position description. Whereas the rest of my resume could pretty much stay standard, right? Because it's a clinical dietitian role. That's an easy way that you could make some adjustments and changes based upon that position description. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go back and I'm going to share the sample resume that I have as a starting point. So this is just one resume that you have in the packet. I'll show you the second one. Okay, so you have a choice at this particular point, okay? And this is where you really kind of need to make a distinction about what you'd like to do. Every intern that I've talked to has done it differently, okay? I do think your dietetic internship needs to be in the education section. The order of your internship is going to vary. So if I am a UW Green Bay graduate, it's most recent, it's going to be first. I can be inclusive under UW Green Bay with my undergraduate degree. But if I came here to do the internship, UW Green Bay is going to be first, that undergraduate degree is going to be behind it because it is not, it's not the highest in that field. And then I have to make those institutions distinguishable, okay? This is the example of where I talked to you about having this overall GPA, semester honors or whatever. If I felt a little better, I could certainly indent it so everybody knows it's underneath this Bachelor of Science in Human Biology. Keep in mind, a resume is selective. It's not like an application. So if I started at UW Oshkosh and after 1 or 2 semesters, I transferred to Green Bay and I finished my degree, my resume just really needs to show the degree earned at UW Green Bay. But on my application, because it says list all educational institutions attended typically, Oshkosh needs to be included. Now, there's one exception. If I'm going to reference something that happened at Oshkosh while I was there, then Oshkosh really should be in that education section, okay? The other thing to keep in mind, this example for Danielle Dietitian has the dietetic internship being inclusive, okay? The length of time and all of the rotations. Some students will choose to pull out that clinical rotation because they really do want to have a clinical job, and they're going to highlight that in more detail. That is perfectly okay for you to do that. I wouldn't recommend having this all-inclusive listing and then breaking them down by each rotation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, you could ask somebody in HR, one of your preceptors, to say, have you ever seen that? Is that a good idea? But typically, you don't want duplicate information on a resume. So I recommend the internship program as a whole, or you're going to pull out some separate experiences. If you pull out the separate experiences, you could consider having a indentation underneath this dietetic internship to say it's a 36-week full-time program and that it has a leadership emphasis, because that is something that is distinctive about our current internship program, okay? When I talked about bullets, this is bullets. So whether you use a dot or a square or whatever, you're consistent. And that makes it easy to scan. Now, some people prefer that. It can take up a little bit more space on a resume, but you can also do a paragraphed approach. And I will show you an example of that in just a moment, all right? But note consistency. I'm starting with my position. It's followed by my date. This is my organization, and this is where it's located. So those 4 pieces of information are pretty critical. Typically, position and date stay together, and organization or employer and where it's located stays together. So you can choose, do I want to lead with my employer, or do I want to lead with my position title, all right? I didn't address it in my PowerPoint presentation, but I talked about experience. Experience is much, much more inclusive than saying employment or saying work experience, okay? Why? Because you can include things that are not paid. So thinking about nutrition experience, very broad, but I could take it one step further. Why? I could go clinical experience because I did my rotation in my internship. Maybe I actually worked in a hospital setting as a dietetic technician while I was going to or a dietetic assistant, and I want to highlight that. So I can be very specific in terms of a functional title when I use experience. I can do leadership experience. I could do educational experience, whatever I want to. And I can also take some of the entries and move them around, because remember, I'm encouraging you to think about a different resume for every type of position, and then make sure and review it when you apply for a specific role, okay? So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and go back, and let's see some other questions that you have, and I can go back and share the screen again as necessary and needed, okay? Is this making sense to you? You can nod your head. Okay. Yes.
So since all of us don't really have adult jobs yet, well, most of us, a lot of our jobs are college person jobs or young person jobs. How far back do you put those on there? Because at what point are you like, yeah, this is irrelevant, like they're not going to care about this? Like what makes those stand out versus just completely ignoring that they ever happened?
Well, think about at least going back to college, all right? Now, if you're a returning adult student and college was several years ago, I'd want you to think about having a discussion with somebody in career services, and we can give you our best recommendation based on your circumstances, okay? Because that's different and ideal for everybody. But at least go back to college and think about, again, a best way to be able to highlight that. So I can have a category that might be food service and restaurant, or food industry experience. Why? Because I worked as a cook. Maybe I was also a wait staff member, and I want them to see that I had early experience dealing with food, nutrition, and so forth. If you just want them to know what the role is, honestly, job title, employer, where it's located, and date, it could just be listed on a line. No more detailed information needed than that, okay? Yes, you can expand on it. And again, remember when you're doing experience and not employment or work history, those academic internships, those volunteer experiences, being involved in some student or community organizations, they can be included in these functional categories as appropriate. Okay. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
What about a job or a volunteer position that you only held for, a summer or a few months? Because I know I'm in the boat, and I'm sure a lot of the other interns are as well, where, throughout undergrad or our experiences now, we have jobs or positions that we've only held for a short period of time. And I know that I don't want to make it messy and look like they only wanted me for 3 months, when really it was more of a time constraint sort of thing.
Right.
How do we approach that?
Well, first of all, most employers understand that when you are a college student, that your experiences might be short-term in nature, because that's how they're designed to be in some cases, right? Secondly, I'm going to introduce a new concept for you here. Okay, I'm going to talk about what I call a master resume. What's a master resume, Linda? This master resume could be 5, 6, 7 pages long. It has everything on it that you just described, right? But in the actual resume you use to apply for a position, it's shorter. It's 2 pages or 1 page, right? But that master resume allows you to pull from something that might really be pretty important and pretty critical to put on a resume given a specific role or opportunity, okay? That's where you can kind of do a little bit of cutting and pasting and choosing for that opportunity. So yes, you've had a 3-month experience in college where you were a volunteer, and you might have been at the new community shelter here in Green Bay, and you only did it for 3 months. But that role possibly could be impactful in what other type of role you might have that you're applying for as a dietitian. It might not be as important for the clinical role, and maybe not as important for the food service, but it could be. Why? Because you might have been helping to prepare large quantities of meals through that community meal program. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's where you're going to pull something and maybe include it, but not include it for something else. But that master resume is where you got everything documented. And it's very easy now to go, yeah, I think that's going to matter, because this program that I have with WIC is also going to be working in tandem with that community meal program that they have in that area. But what you have choice about is, okay, so how much detail do I provide? You might have 6 or 7 bullets about each opportunity that you've got in this master resume, but you're only going to pull 1 or 2, the one most critical, maybe the ones that are more aligned with the position description and the responsibilities or the experiences or requirements or the knowledge they want candidates to have. So you only pull 2 certain bullets. Maybe the next time you pull 2 different bullets. Okay. Now, what I'm telling you, this is work. I admit it. I did it when I was in your shoes, and I've done it throughout my career. It's a lot of work. Most candidates choose not to do it. They've got one standard resume that's for any dietitian role that they want. But I will tell you that you do get better results, and it's more effective if you can do the types of things that I am describing. Other questions for me? Yes.
So this might only be for me, and I apologize if it is, but what if you were in other graduate programs that are clinical experience, but aren't registered dietitian clinical experience, like you were in like a doctorate physical therapy program, but it's still like a year of clinical experience showing that you've been able to be at that level, but it's just not registered dietitian.
Right. Well, here's the thing. So anything that you include on your resume, you have to be prepared to respond. So if you went through a DPT program and you were in it for 1.5 years and you stopped out and you didn't finish it, why? How are you handling answering that question? If you went through the DPT program and you earned it and you worked as a physical therapist, that definitely shows value of working with patients, being within a clinical setting, diagnostic skills, a variety of different things. So you'd have to think about how much do I include or do I not include and in what types of circumstances and settings, okay? Doesn't just apply to a DPT clinical program, it really includes anything that you have on the resume. So for example, I've had students who have been very involved in a meal program that is run through their church, and they're uncomfortable showing their religious affiliation because that is a protected area. You've got a balance between that experience of being involved in the meal program that your church offers in that community versus the religious aspect of it. I can't ask you about your religious affiliation, but I can ask you about your work in that meal program and keep it separate from that. Does that make sense? And every candidate makes those choices very, very differently, okay? Other questions for me? All right, I'm going to go back and I'm going to highlight and share. So just the second resume that's in your packet, which is basically Danielle Dietitian again. And I do these two different formats. So if you've seen me do resume presentations at UW Green Bay before, I typically try to show a variety of different samples, and I use these two formats typically to show some differences. So resumes look different. They can. You can go online, you can see a lot of samples. We've got some samples on our office website. I'm going to discourage you from using a template. Why? Because they are hard to manage and work with and put information in that doesn't follow their standard format. You can very easily create a nice document in Microsoft Word. I've had some students who've done it in Excel because it lines up really well and then they hide all the grid lines. I've also seen people do them pretty well in Publisher and other types of things. I'm going to encourage you to do that and not do templates. Why? Because a lot of other people use templates. And I also have employers who get tired of seeing the same templates over and over again because you Google just like everybody else does, and the same ones come up over and over again, and you just go with them and start. So remember, back to my first presentation, you need to be comfortable with what you look like on paper. This is a format that uses a different approach to the page. The headings and so forth like this, perfectly okay to do that. That manages space a little bit easier and better, okay? Notice I talked about indentation space. As long as there's a clear break here, this is no magic amount of information. I mean, magic amount of space. 2 spaces, 3 spaces, it's up to you as long as it's aligned appropriately, okay? But note that this is an example of a resume that gets additional information onto the resume and still keeps it in one page. This related experience of being the building manager at the union was not on the first resume that I showed you for Danielle Dietitian. Now, if this were my resume, I would argue to change the title. Building manager, supervises, leads other people, leads projects, problem solving. I'd probably change it to maybe leadership experience. But this is an example of some cases, different resume styles can have you add content to a resume in a different way, okay? So whether or not you pull it underneath the headings, your headings are centered or whatever, keep in mind, an English-based resume in the United States, we're reading from left to right. So you want your content and your headings on the left margin. I frankly think that's better in some way than having them centered. But there are other styles and formats that you can use where you might see, dates aligned over here. I will tell you, I'm not a big proponent of having an emphasis placed on dates. I think if you ask most people, a title or the organization provides more information than just when it happened, unless somebody is really overly concerned about job history. And at this point, unless you're a returning adult student, which might have some gaps of employment, that's not going to be a concern. Why? Because you're working on your undergraduate degree and you're transitioning into this next program. Most cases, there isn't consistent employment for 4 or 5 or 6 years or so forth, okay? So keep that in mind, all right? Notice that you can do some things to combine memberships and service. So I want to indicate that I've done something with Big Brothers Big Sisters because I've consistently done it, but I need to make sure that I show it in a specific way. And then this is that example of that references sheet that I mentioned. You're going to have the same heading as whatever your resume is. You're going to take your references, a minimum of 3. I wouldn't list any more than 6 total on a given references sheet. And make sure you list how they can be contacted and put them in order of importance. Now, again, here's another example. You could have 10 or 11 people who you've asked to be references for you. Anybody who's been a preceptor, the people that you work with in the program, somebody from your undergraduate experience, a previous employer, an advisor to a student group or a volunteer organization. Have a master list of references and pick and choose who you want to use for each one you submit. So if they ask for references, call this references for Bellin Hospital so that I know that I sent these to Bellin, and maybe I sent some different ones to Howard Suamico School District for that food service position, okay? So you've got control over that. Always make certain that you talk to people as references, either virtually, face-to-face, or via email. You ask if they can serve as a reference. That way they give the opportunity of whether or not they think they can provide a solid reference for you. And you communicate with them the best method of how that information can be communicated. Some people are not comfortable with you sharing a cell phone. Some people are. They want a work location, or they want a work email only. Those are the types of things that you'll kind of work out when you have that conversation. And you have this references sheet, and you provide it if references are asked. If you are being interviewed and you ask if reference information can be provided, you include that, okay? But this is not part of that 2-pager. This would be that addendum or 3rd page of that resume, okay? All right, so I'm stopping again. Questions, resume writing, samples, alignment, formatting, questions about references.
I've got another question, Linda.
Nope, keep going, that works.
What is your opinion on, I know you mentioned staying away from templates because you don't want to bore the person reading the resume because they've seen a template a million times. How do you feel about using a Canva template? My resume is a Canva template. I like kind of customized it, and I know it's not going to be for everybody, but it has a little bit of color on it. It has my picture on it. It's like a little more fun, I feel like, but I don't know.
Right.
What's your stance on that?
Well, first and foremost, I would discourage you from having a picture on your resume.
Okay.
That opens up discrimination. And honestly,
Okay.
some HR departments won't accept resumes with pictures for that very reason.
Okay.
Now, if you like having a graphic on a resume, whether it might be something that's nutrition related, I've seen the symbol for a profession, variety of different things to kind of make the resume look graphically appealing. Those are some choices you make, and realize that's, again, different opinions about whether or not it's good or it's bad or whatever. I always want to make sure that if you pick color, that it's going to be picked up if it's scanned pretty well, because typically darker colors, black, brown, navy, pick up better than maybe a lighter blue or a lighter gray. That would be something to be concerned about, okay? The other thing that I need to mention too is, and this is going to sound kind of crazy, and it might be on your template, but it might not be, but it made me think of it, is I don't recommend people creating an actual header on the document. And you know what I mean, a header, specifically content that's in the header, which is usually your contact information and your name. Don't use a header. Why? Because there are applicant tracking systems that the header information isn't read, and then the resume has no name on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So create that, but don't put it in a header. So without actually looking at what kind of visual template you're talking about, it's kind of hard to make some additional comments. I have seen some templates though that literally the top third of the resume is nothing but the person's name, maybe the dietitian label or word, and their contact information, okay? And it doesn't present well. Why? Because the bottom 2/3 of the paper is really what's most important. So some templates are like that. Having columns on a resume, perfectly acceptable. My 1-page resume that I mentioned to you has columns, all right? but it's easy to navigate and it's clearly understood about what's in a column and what's not. I'm not mixing experiences or information, okay?
Gotcha.
Did that answer the question that you had?
Yeah, it did.
Okay.
Also having like a link to your LinkedIn. I mean, I know obviously there's maybe some exporting issues where the link wouldn't work or whatever else, but like having a link to your LinkedIn or having like, if you have a food page on Instagram or something, like having a link to that, is that like a no-no or is that okay?
Well, first of all, LinkedIn, a link to your LinkedIn profile is very appropriate because LinkedIn is your technically your professional appearance on social media. All right. I would defer to that. And I would not think about Instagram or Facebook unless you are going to significantly clean it up and there's not going to be personal stuff on that. Okay.
Right, yeah, just like a professional Instagram is what I've been.
Right. So if you've got a professional Instagram and you've got pictures of you doing a cooking demonstration, be leery of any pictures that you have that might display confidential information or individuals that should not be presented, potentially minors. So you might have to make sure that those pictures are ghosted.
Gotcha.
Why? Well, that shows your sensitivity, right? Confidential information, minors, and not displaying that information because I didn't get permission ahead of time. You don't want to open up things that wouldn't be opened because you chose to share the Instagram link. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you.
questions. And we'll get to LinkedIn a little bit later in our time this morning. And I can answer some specific questions about LinkedIn, but having that LinkedIn URL is perfectly okay. If you happen to have a URL that you've created, maybe a website or a wiki page, maybe where you've got samples like an online portfolio, that's appropriate as well. Okay. And you can also include those links too in your email signature as you might email people. Okay, other questions? Yes.
How do you feel about academic things? Like when you're applying to this, we put like our GPAs and honor rolls and all of those things, but do jobs generally care about what your GPA was and all that stuff?
There are organizations that do have GPA requirements.
Oh.
So keeping your GPA on initially for the first couple of years, I think is not a bad idea. Now, anybody who knows anything about a dietetic internship program is going to know that you don't have a GPA associated with that. So there shouldn't be any concern that I've got a GPA as an undergraduate and I don't have a GPA with my dietetic internship program. I happen to think if you've got a very solid GPA of a 3.7, it's probably pretty obvious to the person that you've gotten some academic honors. So if you're trying to balance what's most important, I have my GPA, I don't have space to put the academic honors because I want to put something else. Where do I give? I'd probably give on the academic honors because my GPA is going to show that I've had some academic honors. But if I struggled early on in my academic career, and that means my overall GPA is not as ideal as I would have liked it to be. So it's a 3.4, but I earned semester honors or dean's lists my last 2 semesters, then maybe there's a more compelling reason to put it on. These are the types of kind of internal discussions you've got to have with yourself. Okay.
Can I make just a comment about references?
Yes, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, so I was gonna mention, and Linda, you can definitely correct me or say, add anything, but I would definitely recommend when you ask someone to be the reference, I was told to maybe ask if they'd be a positive reference for you. I don't hear people ask that a lot, but I feel like you might want to clarify that just to make sure this person is going to be positive. And then also I would say, when you do reach, so definitely reach out to them if you're like, okay, I applied for this job, I had the interview, they said they're gonna check references. And typically then I'll ask people to send me the link to the job description and then send me their most up-to-date resume that they use. And so that's gonna help me make sure I speak to your characteristics that are more specific to that job instead of just being general information I have. So I always ask that when someone asks me to be a reference, if they can send that information information to me. If it's like we just had an interview, if it's like, can I have you as a reference when I'm applying, they say yes, and then reach out to me when they may be contacting me. So anything else you want to add to that, Linda? Or
I
Shane?
agree with what Heather said. I was going to expand on and tell you to treat your references like gold. The more information you give them, the more help they can be to you. So keep in communication. Send them a copy of your resume, send them the link to the position so that they can be responsive to that. Always go back and let them know the end result. So hopefully in June, you're going back to your references and you're saying, thank you for serving as a reference for me. I can happily announce that I've accepted a position with XYZ, okay? Now, in 2 or 3 years, you go back and you're applying for a different role now. Don't just assume that because Heather said she'd be a reference 3 years ago, that Heather's still willing to be a reference for you. I've had that happen to me where I will get a random email or a phone call about a reference for a student that I was like 4 years ago. I haven't heard from that person in 4 years. Not the best situation to be in, okay? So anytime you're looking for a job, you need to think about your references. What are the best references? Because yeah, Heather might have been a great reference 4 years ago, but you might have references because you've worked now for 4 years since that internship that are actually more impactful. So you need to give some thought to that, okay? All right, any other questions about resumes and references? Because we're coming up on being a little after 10 o'clock and I'd like to give you a break so you can get up, stretch, walk, use a restroom or whatever you need to do. But I want to make sure we've got any questions you have about this addressed and covered. All right, during the break, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up and pull up a sample so I can show you what I meant by that paragraph style, if that's a choice that you would like to be able to do, okay? So Heather, if it's okay, we'll take a break and maybe come back somewhere between like 10, 12, 10, 15.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
All right, wonderful.
That's what I said. Oh, yeah, yeah. What did you ever intro? I like something that we're done. Yeah.
So, thank you.
Your resume.
But it was.
And a clinical job. They have what I need. They want like fluff. Yeah. So it depends on where. Yeah. I always help with
And then of course, it's
like that. I know they might love listening to our professional Instagram.
Right.
To see like switching stuff I enjoy and then they can see.
Right.
Yeah, no problem.
I love talking about this.
Yeah, we do. Talk all day,
Gonna mute us here as I'm yelling.